Welcome, everybody. My name's Sabina Virgo, and this is a debate. Oh, my goodness. This is a debate on electoral politics. And thank you all so much for coming. The ground rules here are we have 4 speakers. They're going to have about 15 minutes each to speak. Actually, not about. They're not going to have more than that because I'm sort of difficult on time. And then we're going to have almost an hour to have a group discussion. The comments and questions from the participants are going to be limited to 2 minutes. I borrowed my friend's stopwatch so that, and I will tell you when your time is up, and I would ask you to respect that so that we can have as many people participate in as much dialogue as we can get. Okay, is that acceptable to people? Yes. Okay. So it's now about 4:15. We will be completed with the panel presentation at 5:15. And then why don't we say that we'll end at 6 and we'll have 45 minutes of conversation and discussion. Okay. In our quick discussion prior to starting this, Gary Gordon agreed to go first. And let me tell you a little bit about Gary. Gary, who's from the Peace and Freedom Party, grew up in Gainesville, Florida. He attended Emory University and graduated from Northwestern University in 1974. After returning to Gainesville and working in the anti-nuclear organization Catfish Alliance and several other community organizations, he was elected to the Gainesville City Commission in 1983, and he served as mayor of Gainesville from 1985 to 1986. Mr. Mayor. He moved to Venice, California in 1991 and has served on the Los Angeles Central Committee of the Peace and Freedom Party since 2006. So I introduce to you Gary Gordon.
Let me start by asking a couple of questions. How many people here are running for office? Raise your hand. One person. Excellent. Two. What's your name?
Marshall Blasowski.
Okay, and what are you running for?
Running for the Board of Trustees, Long Beach City College.
Excellent. And who else is running?
My name is Mike Powell, and I'm running for U.S. Congress in the 30th Congressional District, which is the West Banana Belt.
Excellent, and I've heard excellent things about you, so that's wonderful. How many people here are working in an electoral campaign to elect someone? 4, 5, I am 2. Okay, so most people not running, most people not working in a campaign. Well, we're here to talk.
Next year.
Yeah.
Right, it's not here.
Uh-oh, we have an audience rebellion.
There are feelings around that question.
We're here to talk, that's good. We're here to talk about electoral politics, and apparently it's a debate, so I think someone is going to be opposing that. I am here to represent being a fervent advocate of electoral politics, working in electoral politics, and also working in third-party politics as a political party. I'm in the Peace and Freedom Party. Mike's here from the Green Party. A lot of mutual respect. How many people know the name Paul Soglin? Okay, couple, 2 or 3 people. Paul was an anti-war activist in the late 60s in Madison, Wisconsin, and ran for mayor and won in the early 70s. And he's one of the people that influenced me to think that we could move from being in the streets into being into the halls and rooms where the decisions are made. How many people know the name Julian Bond? Okay, just about everybody. Andrew Young. Okay, I worked in Andrew Young's first congressional campaign. He lost. John Lewis. Okay, Bobby Seale. Bobby, when he ran for mayor of Oakland, campaigned in part on buses. And so when I ran, I did that. And after I got elected, I was talking with the city manager, and he said, "How did you win?" I said, "Well, I campaigned on buses." And he said, "Where'd you get that idea?" I said, "From Bobby Seale." And right away, we were going to be oil and water. We ended up firing him. And of course, the name Ralph Nader. I don't mention that in terms of him being a political candidate, but he was one of the people early on who said, we have got to gain power. We have got to be in the rooms and be part of where the decisions are made. So I'm going to advocate that, and what I want to do with my time is illustrate the difference that having someone in power can make. And I'm going to use myself as an example. So it's going to sound like all I'm doing is talking about myself, but really I'm talking about a lot of people who helped put me in that position and a lot of people who I worked with in order to get these things done. It was not a solo effort in any means. Among the things that I was able to accomplish, again with a lot of help, during the 3 years that I was on the Gainesville City Commission, I lowered the utility rates and maintained lower rates. Gainesville owned its own utilities, so that was possible, and it was one of the reasons that I ran and why I'm an advocate for public power in the utility sense of the word, as well as in the electoral sense of the word. I helped save the funding of the Alternative Community Theater, secured partial funding for a breakfast program, increased water and wastewater fees for developers so that they began to pay their share of the development that went on rather than putting that burden on the residents of the community, including the renters for whom it would be passed through to them in rent. We did not have rent control. Increase the public review of the city and utility budgets. And I'll probably come back to the budget because the budget is the key document of any municipal government and pretty much any government, knowing where the money is and what can be done with it and what can't and so on. Arranged for and supported no smoking in public meeting places. We were the first city in Florida to do that. This again is in the early 80s. Some of these things are common now and even more widespread. Proposed and accomplished divestment of city pension funds and corporations doing business with or in South Africa. This again we were the first city in the state of Florida to do this. Increased energy conservation efforts. Held the line on cable TV costs for basic cable. This is back when municipalities had the power to do that. Worked for increased bike lanes and successfully against several 6-lane road projects. Bike lanes are sort of normal now, even if they're not perfect, and it's still a matter of discussion, but it's not this incredible controversy where you have to fight with the state road department. Back in the early 80s, the state road department and many cities would just say no. So that was kind of unique at the time. I helped with that. My mentor, who had preceded me in office, was the main guy that worked on that. Proposed a city holiday for Martin Luther King Jr. birthday, which was before Reagan implemented that nationally. Increased public works funding for projects in lower income areas. Led effort to create and implement the city recycling program. Again, recycling was not normal then. It was this exotic, strange, very much opposed by waste management companies, including Waste Management Incorporated itself. And I ended up flying to Austin and meeting with a lady named Beth Brown there in around 1983 or 84 to get some tips from her about how they did it in Austin, which was one of the celebrated communities where it had occurred. And she gave me some excellent tips, and I came back and we got it done. We got it done as a pilot program first in one neighborhood that was populated by a lot of World War II veterans. And I appealed to them on the basis of the Victory Garden idea, which they were familiar with. Hey, let's all get together and do this as a positive, and they agreed, and we got it done. And now recycling is pretty much normal. Improvements still need to be made, obviously. Supported and successfully worked for the pay increase for bus drivers. I was supported by the CWA, which is the City Utility Workers Union, the firefighters, and the PBA. Successfully fought state legislation efforts to reduce city power over planning, zoning, law enforcement, and fire service. There were many people in the state government that essentially wanted to defang the city government because we were standing in the way of what they had been able to do in most of the rest of the state, which was just pave everything. And we were sort of the lone example, so they had to be stood up to. And one of the reasons I was defeated when I ran for re-election was because they really mounted a very, very strong effort and ultimately succeeded in ousting me. But my ouster led to other people organizing to make sure that that didn't happen again. And subsequently, some excellent people got elected to the city and the county government. So maybe my defeat served a purpose at that point. I wasn't totally sanguine about it then. Successfully worked to preserve the bus system, which was always at risk. Initiated utility services to areas in the county that were threatened by gasoline spillage into the water supply. This turned out to be more controversial than I thought it would be. Fought with mixed results to maintain the city domain over the airport. We owned the airport. Supported firing the city manager, brought in a new city manager, led the firing of the city attorney, worked to expose theft in the city bus system, opposed mostly successfully several environmentally threatening developments, and accomplished shifting more funds to low-income housing. That's not a complete list. It's a partial list, but I hope that that gives you an idea of what one individual, and I think Mike will speak to this too. He served longer than I did in his role in Santa Monica. What one individual with a certain amount of community support and assistance can accomplish when instead of being on the outside is on the inside. And this is really my fundamental point. The reason that I'm invested in electoral politics is that I've seen people in office and felt it myself make a difference. For all the protesting that I did, for all the in-the-street work that I did, Gainesville is a community of about 100,000 people plus the college students. These things that I did on this list and that I got the other council members to agree to even before I had a majority. I didn't really have a solid guaranteed majority until I was in my third year. These things benefited more people more often in their daily lives than almost anything that I was part of as a protester. Because as a protester, I didn't conceive of it this way at the time, but I was really always just begging, asking, demanding, cajoling, persuading, but never really having the power to do. And so sure, a lot of gains were contributed to. I don't know that I would have gotten the city to divest in the funds we had invested that connected to South Africa if there hadn't been an anti-apartheid movement. But ultimately, that was a very controversial meeting. And it was controversial in some respects because there were some city union people that did not want that to happen because they felt their pensions might be at risk. So it's very weird to sort of have to deal with that. And that's the other thing about being in office. When you're in office, you have to deal with a lot of realities that you have the luxury to not deal with when you're simply protesting. It's no longer the slogan. It is the face-to-face conversation with constituents. And sometimes you find yourself in that rock and a hard place where you've promised when you ran to do A and you also promised to do B, and then suddenly A and B come in conflict. And I used to do that against one of the other people that was on the council because she would promise everybody everything. So an item would come up and I knew that I could catch her in a squeeze play. I just told all her different people to show up and watch her squirm. And it was a lot of fun. But I found myself a couple of times caught in that squeeze too. And it's not fun, but it's the responsibility. Now, being able to make those decisions and benefiting that amount of people, that's possible in Santa Monica, it's possible in Culver City, it's possible in Los Angeles, it's possible all throughout the area and all throughout the country. And unfortunately what I see is the right wing taking advantage of this more than our side. Now part of why I'm an advocate for electoral politics is I know how flexible and how insecure it is. You can make these changes, as I did, and then the next majority comes in and reverses everything. But the goal is to try and institutionalize the change. It's not just to want the change. It's not just to get the change. It's to try and institutionalize the change so that it's tougher for it to be reversed. Now, we're living in a time now where a lot of changes that we thought were pretty secure are getting reversed. And they're getting reversed in part because the right wing is taking advantage of the electoral process where the left wing is not. I run into a lot of people, and I don't know how many people in this room are this way. This is a debate, so apparently one of us is, who have more or less decided that electoral politics doesn't work, won't work, and it's not the way to go. And what we should do is camp out fast and do exactly essentially what the other side wants us to do, which is not to have a home, not to eat any food, and, you know, not to have a job. I mean, my comrade Cindy points this out. What are you doing? You're doing what they want. No, we want to have homes, we want to have jobs, we want to have food, and we want to have power, and we're going to have to work for it and earn it. So let me close again by saying I'm working in the Cindy Sheehan campaign at the moment for, she's running for governor of California. Now, I know that she's not going to win, but I believe that it's very important to have that voice. This is a slight departure for me because my upbringing in Florida was run to win, and that's what I did. But sometimes the choices are so bad, you know, between someone who wants the prison system and someone who wants the prison system, that you have to say to you, or someone who won't do really anything about the war or wants it, and someone who won't do anything about the war and wants it, or someone who won't really support working people and someone who won't really support working people or will actually be against them. And you have to say, okay, wait a minute, we need at least a voice in this conversation to say there is an alternative. It's a long-term investment to work in a third party. It's going to be tough. We may or may not be in that pre-period where we get to where we need to go, where people are ready to be organized, but they're not going to be organized if we don't work at it, and they're certainly not going to be organized if we put down electoral politics or walk away from electoral politics or say, yeah, it just doesn't work. So I'll end with what I started out with and acknowledge that people have worked in campaigns in the past and are intending to work. For me, it's always an election year. It's always an election year. So I'll include the people who let's say I'm not interested in if you have, but if you are intending to work, if you are or are intending to work in a political campaign, please raise your hand. Okay, still not quite a majority. We're still less than the majority of the people here. And how many people are going to run for office? Are going to. And if you're not, my question to you is why not? Because my story could be your story. It's not a unique story. It's not a privileged story. It's not, hey, I'm this. It's available to anybody. You start attending meetings. You start learning the lay of the land. You start networking. Maybe Mike will talk a little bit more about his history on this. And you build an organization. And then maybe you're the one to be running, and maybe you're the one to be supporting someone else running. But why not think of yourself as a candidate? Why not think of yourself as someone who ought to be in the room making the decisions, deciding how the money is spent? What is the public policy on this issue or that issue? How, in municipal government, how is the land going to be used? Because that's the most important thing that municipal governments decide. Who gets to use the land for what? That's municipal government. Land, money, public policy. Everyone in this room should be part of that, and there's no reason why people shouldn't think of themselves as a candidate And if you don't, there's no reason why you shouldn't be working for someone who does think of themselves as a candidate. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce my second good friend on the panel, Mike Feinstein. He is in the Green Party, and Mike played an integral role in the successful 1990-1991 ballot drive of the Green Party of California. He's been elected to the Los Angeles County Council and the State Party Coordinating Committee. He has nationally represented California at 3 Green presidential conventions and the Green National Committee, as well as serving as an international Green Party USA delegate to the Global Greens and once to the Federation of the Green Parties of the Americas. He's been a part of the UN World Summit on sustainable development in South Africa, and he is also quite well known within our own community for the work that he's done. I'd like to turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Sabina. I just need this slide. So, I was on the city council for 8 years in Santa Monica. I was mayor for 2 years. If I lived in a functioning democracy, I'd be in the state legislature today. And if I lived in Los Angeles, I might have never even been on the city council. Green parties in about 100 countries around the world, so we've gotten to see different electoral systems that people in this country aren't even exposed to. So I'm going to talk about 2 of them, and one change on the state level, one change on the city of LA level. How many of you are from California? Almost everybody here? Okay. So let's start out with our state legislature, all right? Slide here. And I did this because I really want to get this stuff in people's head. We have the worst representation in the United States in our state legislature, and the next worst state, Texas, is 3.5 times better. Or conversely, we are 3.5 times worse than Texas. Okay, let that sink in. And the last constitutional convention that we had that set the size of our legislature was in 1879, when we had about 850,000 people in the state. We have 37 million. So we have 80 seats in the lower house, 40 seats in the upper house, 120 representatives for 37 million people. It's absolutely ridiculous. So number one, per capita, we suffer from great underrepresentation in this state. Number two, we have the winner-take-all system where we are in single-seat districts. So the result of that, first on the bottom of this, is that Democrats and Republicans, before Proposition 14, the top 2 primary came in, that's a discussion we can get to in the Q&A. But before that, essentially, we've had 5, 6, 7 ballot-qualified parties in California. The Democrats and Republicans normally get between 80 and 90-some% of the vote if those other parties are competing, but they get 100% of the seats. So number one, we have a system where Democrats and Republicans are overrepresented in our current system. And then what happens on the flip side, the smaller parties, Peace and Freedom, Greens, Libertarians, American Independent, we're underrepresented. And the people who vote for us are underrepresented. They never get anybody. Greens, we've won 1 seat in the state legislature once, and we can talk about that in the Q&A, very special circumstances. But otherwise, so you've got overrepresentation for the large parties, underrepresentation for the smaller parties, and then even between the Ds and the Rs, you've got this situation this year where the Democrats have 2/3 of the legislature. They didn't win 2/3 of the vote. WTF. So, what's wrong with all that system? So, first reform, proportional representation. Okay, at the bottom there. What is it? Instead of electing people in a single-seat district, you elect them from multi-seat districts. I mean, do we ever get exposed to this at all in our schools? No. And if it's in the New York Times, they cover an election in some other country, and they say that complicated system that they have, as if somehow, people in Ireland or Australia or Germany or Sweden, they're so much smarter than we are. We couldn't possibly conceive of how to vote in these systems. But they somehow are able to do it, even though we're all in the Olympics and we're all in the UN, but they can figure it out and we can't. So, all right, how does it work? What does it do for us? First of all, if a party gets 20% of the vote, they get 20% of the seats. 5% of the vote, you get 5% of the seats. So everybody's at the table to start with, and then you have majority rule, rather than our current system where you eliminate most people from the table to start with. So first, you have majority and minority representation, so that everybody's there. Number two, more people vote. Why do more people vote? Because almost everybody has a chance for their vote to actually elect somebody who shares their views. Right now, if you're a Democrat in a Republican district, a Republican in a Democrat district, you're not going to elect somebody. If you're a Green or Peace and Freedom, you're not going to elect somebody. So, you go out, you cast your vote. It's a good, you're fighting the good fight. It's nice to, on election day, have your vote count in that number in the losing column, and then it's over. So a lot of people don't vote because they don't feel it's going to really matter. And functionally, it matters only to a small degree. But in other countries where your vote is most likely to elect somebody, the turnout is in the 70 to 90-something% range. For us, we're given these kind of con job numbers where we say 50, 60, 70% turnout, but that's of registered voters. And only about 2/3 of all potential voters are even registered, or half. It depends on where. So the bottom line is not that many people are really voting in our system, where a proportional system gets more people to turn out. Next, diversity and representation. In our current system, there's all sorts of different ways that you can imagine diversity, but if you have a chance to have a smaller number of people elect somebody, then different groups in your society can self-segment and elect somebody who represents them. Now, whatever diversity that they represent, they have a chance of that being at the table. From a gender standpoint, when you look at systems of winner-take-all compared to proportional systems have way more women than winner-take-all systems. And all different other types of diversity, it's just at the table to start with. And then finally, campaign finance reform. For as much appreciation as I have for all my friends in the clean money movement, I really feel sorry for them because they missed the point here. The analogy I use is in renewable energy. If we had to replace the total amount of energy that we project in a wasteful fossil fuel system with solar power, it'd be very, very difficult. The plan to go to renewables is to become more efficient and to conserve and then fill in that reduced need with the sun. And in an electoral system, if you have to have the money to win a winner-take-all district, you're trying to get people to vote for you who don't agree with you. To get a majority, the fact is in most districts, if you had, there's a whole bunch of different perspectives in a district, but to get a majority, you got to get a bunch of people who really aren't there with you as a core to vote for you. You got to spend a lot of money. But what if you only need 20% of the vote? Now you start going to the places, the community institutions, be it a church, be it whatever, where people like you hang out, and you're just meeting them, and then their votes elect somebody, and you're not spending tons of money in direct mail and TV advertising, etc., to try and convince people to get on board. So the folks who are trying to get clean money, it's going to have to be replaced by public financing. And the amount of public financing we will need is such a large number to replace the amount spent in winner-take-all systems that it's going to be used against us every time we want to argue to go to public financing. So all the folks that are spending all their time on that are really missing the boat, that you have to combine that with a reform of how we elect the people. It's not just, quote, getting money out of politics. It isn't going to work by itself. It's not going to sell, and it doesn't work by itself. Then gerrymandering. And here's one of the most interesting things. Think about the U.S. Congress, all this la-di-da that we're hearing about Texas and how they've gerrymandered everything. Crazy enough, when we go back to the Voting Rights Act, the rightful desire to have really diverse representation has become a tool to screw us. Because what you do there is you draw districts. Let's say that there's a certain number of concentrations of African Americans in your state. Well, you draw a couple of districts that are 95% African American, and now you put all those voters in one place. They get one representative, or maybe two, and you've taken them out of all the other districts. So the Voting Rights Act is being used to actually cut down the number of seats that people who we want to represent actually can elect. It's a crazy tool. So if you go to a proportional system, by contrast, you don't worry about individual districts. You can have a whole statewide district effectively, and then just elect people from that however they want to self-district themselves. So then we drop down to how can we do it? Couple plans. This is an interesting one that came out of some folks with the New America Foundation. And what this does is, instead of taking the whole state and making it a single district, a lot of people have been familiar with the ideas of trying to split California. It's too big, it's ungovernable, etc. And we also have the problem that we elect people from single seat districts, and yet the nature of land use, of economics in California is regional. And if we want to be talking about regional housing policy that goes along with regional rail lines, for example, we just elect people from individual areas, and we don't have a collective dialogue within a region. So this plan is to divide the state into 8 sub-regions, and then to run a proportional representation election from each. Now you start having regional discussions, and you bring people in with some sort of regional mandate along with proportional representation. So in effect, you're breaking up the nation state into smaller sub-states and still gaining the coordination that you have of everybody together. Here's the number of seats that would go with each of those regions. So an LA area that had greater population would have, and this is one where you have 100, let's say the number. You see the number there. So basically, by population, still you'd have different numbers of people elected from these different areas, but you're still doing it proportionally from those areas as well. This is a sort of system that would make a lot of sense for California. Then we shift from there, because I'm timing it well, thank you, Sabina, to City of LA. All right? We just went through another election. Everybody's mad about all the negative campaigning and all the expense, and only one woman gets elected, and yet no discussion of how the system did it. So, a couple of reforms for the City of LA. Number one, terrible turnout in Los Angeles. Terrible turnout. Why? The election is in the spring of an off year when nobody's paying attention. All right? So, in Santa Monica, we used to have it that way, but we changed in the early 1980s to consolidate our local elections with the November general elections, when everybody is out to vote, when there's all sorts of campaigns turning people out. It's president, it's governor, it's Congress, etc. There's a reason to turn out. Now a whole lot more people are part of the decision making. So one thing that the City of LA needs to do, in my opinion, is put a ballot measure on that changes their election from that time to a November general election. A lot of people argue, well, there's too many issues on the November ballot. Frankly, as Rachel and Jay will say from Santa Monica, we don't have any trouble figuring it out about doing local elections. And the fact is, we pay more attention to our local elections now. Our turnout in Santa Monica went up, enormously when we made it in the general. And again, are people smarter west of Centinela than east of Centinela? I think people in LA are capable of doing it as well. Number two, okay, the way we do these elections also makes them more expensive. Why? Because you're in runoffs. You have to run 2 elections. I mean, pretty basic. If you run in 1 election, it's different than 2 elections. You don't need as much money. So the reform that I'm going to get to next talks about how you do it in 1 election. Third, negative campaigning. Once you get into a runoff, your way to win, I mean, if we think back to some of the racist Han versus Villaraigosa campaign in 01, it's very easy to trash your other opponent when there's only one other opponent. But if there's 5 or 6, you can't play the same racial politics or some of the other ones as easily as you can, because voters can move around to a bunch of different places. But the way LA sets it up is if you end up with a 2-way race, you promote more negative campaigning. So what's the alternative on a municipal level? It's called ranked choice voting, where you can rank the candidates in the order of your preference until somebody ultimately gets a majority. How do they get to a majority? If nobody's got a majority after you cast your first preferences, you drop the bottom candidate off. Whoever voted for them, what was their second choice? The vote goes to them. Moves it up, eventually somebody gets a majority. And when you do that, you can have 1 election. What would that do in the City of LA? First, you save $5 to $9 million. If you do that for school board, community college district, and city council and the other citywide races. So first of all, it saves a lot of money. 2, I just spoke before about how it changes that one-on-one dynamic as well. 3, this so-called spoiler dynamic, where you're sitting there. Let's say that I had run in LA, and I was the most progressive person. And you're like, oh God, am I going to vote for Mike? Or maybe he's not going to win. And we've all gone through that sort of thing. You don't have to do that in ranked choice voting. So then what happens is, let's say that you voted for me with the first choice. I didn't win, but I was for some really great issue that you resonated with. Now the person who wins sees that 20% of their vote came from people who voted for me first. There's a clear mandate, whereas if you flip it in the other direction and they just go ahead and hold their nose and vote for the lesser of evil, now you've understated the support in the electorate for whatever that key issue might have been. So we send the wrong signals to the ultimate winners. They use it in Oakland and San Francisco. A couple of links there that you can go ahead and check it out. Finally, the number of seats in LA, per capita representation. We have the worst per capita representation in the City of LA in the United States. Okay, 260,000 to 1. We have 15 council members. New York has 51. Chicago has 50. We have 15. Our next most populous cities, look at those ratios of representation compared to ours. Nobody is close to ours. No state legislature, except for our own California, for the statewide seats has as bad per capita as we do, and only 3 states even have half as bad as we do. So if we make the districts smaller, it's cheaper to run, and we have more seats, and you're closer to the grassroots. How many should we have in Los Angeles? Well, unfortunately, the Charter Review Commission in '99 put up 2 modest measures to go to 21 and 25 seats. They lost, but there were a lot of issues about Black versus Latino that played at the time there that got into this, and we didn't have neighborhood councils. Now people have neighborhood councils. They're a little more in touch with how smaller districts can work and what the connection there would be. So down the line, I know I'm punching through this. In my opinion, what we would end up doing in LA, which would make the most sense, is a single ballot measure that does 3 things. 1, it moves the elections to November. Number 2, it increases the size of the LA City Council. And 3, it puts in ranked choice voting. And then with ranked choice voting, the final thing I'll say here to close is that there's 2 different, look, if we're the size of San Jose, or the same sort of representation of San Jose, we'd have 39 people. If you're like San Francisco, we'd have 51 people. And our size was set in 1925 when our population was so small. So the final thing that we'd want to work on with all of this is, in my opinion, we should go about 50-some seats in the city of LA. Do we make them all individual seats? Or, let's say 51 seats, like New York? Do we have 51 single-seat districts? Or maybe 17 districts with 3 seats? If you go to 17, and this was my last point, if you go to 17 with 3, and this is one of the things that just pisses me off with LA politics. I'm just getting out of that light. The fiefdom bullshit in LA politics where nobody will talk about development in somebody else's district because they're the representative from that district, and please don't talk about my district because then I won't talk about your district and how really bad development happens in LA. If you had several people from a district who came from different political backgrounds, you might have 2 Ds and 1 R in some districts, 2 Rs and 1 D, or you might have a green or peace and freedom mixed in that. If you have that, there's no ownership, and there's different political points of view in a district, and now you don't have that sort of dynamic that you have in the city of LA, which, land use is so bad there, and you want to throw up, and that's one of the reasons that we lost redevelopment money, because they were so bad with that. So, those are a couple of modest reforms that can help the state and the local.
Thank you very much. Oh no, what would we do? The next person I'm going to introduce is probably, of all the introductions I've ever done in all my life, this introduction has to be the shortest. Now, I hope I'm going to pronounce your last name right, my brother. Is Craig Tonis? Tonis. Yep. Craig Tonis hasn't voted since the first season of the American Idol. Craig!
Yeah, a little levity is good. I have a whole thing planned out, but I'm going to say something extemporaneously, which may go wild. Before I went to Occupy in 2011, I want to say I shared Mike's view. I was really interested in mixed member proportional representation and first past the post voting and the problems inherent in all of that. And I thought it was interesting, and this is a debate, so I'm just going to put this out there, and you'll get a chance, obviously. But that the Voting Rights Act itself, I just want to make clear, actually precludes mixed member proportional representation on a national level. So I want this in the back of everybody's heads that a process that we're at here at an eco-socialism conference to change the electoral system to include MMPR, which is a brilliant idea, would require us to engage in a very big process of changing the entire electoral process, and to do like California, to do national elections, it would require us to change the Constitution, a constitutional amendment against the civil right, the 16th Amendment, whatever. I'm sorry. It's been a while since I thought about this because I gave up on it after Occupy, and I'm going to go into my prepared stuff now. But I just want to think about those things because that's part of where my brief bio comes from. So obviously I'm not a politician, so I'm going to be a little nervous and scattered here and not really as set as my 2 previous friends. To start, I'm bemused by my own inclusion on this very panel. I don't see myself as having any special access to information that isn't available to all of us here today. I don't have a lot of personal experience in electoral politics. As you may have just heard in my brief bio, the last time I voted was during the first season of American Idol, and even then I was phoning it in. Ba-dum-bum. Thank you, hi-hat. Being a non-voter, however, isn't much of a distinction, of course. Only 12% of registered voters here in Los Angeles voted for our new mayor, Eric Garcetti. I'd like you to join me in thinking about that for a moment. We live in a city where 88% of those registered to vote didn't vote for the city's leader. In fact, the overwhelming majority, including the undocumented people with felony convictions and others denied participation, aren't even included in that figure. So reform-minded people believe this is an indication that we need better voter recruitment, right? But as I sit on this panel with three passionate advocates for social and ecological justice who have clearly devoted time to that very project, I don't see the tangible fruits of their labor. In fact, the level of environmental degradation has worsened. From the Facebook invite to this, for the first time since the Pliocene, CO2 levels have now reached 400 parts per million. I think that's important to keep in mind here. So what am I doing here on this panel? Why am I here, and what can I contribute to the dialogue we're having today? My original plan for participation here was to demonstrate how futile I think the electoral process is. So when I first accepted this token anarchist position I'm taking up here, as the antagonist here, I began scheming with my comrades about how to use this conference and my position on this very panel to draw an elaborate analogy to the electoral process itself. The point would be to emphasize how the urgency of the issues today prove electoral politics are insufficient. You see, right now, I'm functioning as a representative much the same way a representative government allegedly functions in the United States. So as your representative on this panel, somebody who can't speak very clearly and has really nervous anxiety and is reading from this paper, I have a certain amount of power right now. I can say whatever I want. I could say, "What about the elephants?" right now. Say I just screamed about elephants apropos of nothing. And that's the kind of power I'm talking about. I'm controlling the dialogue. And I could talk about elephants for the rest of my time up here if I want, much the same way our elected representatives use feints and sleight of hand to distract us with topics like debt ceilings and whatnot. And let's be honest, if this panel here were a government post and not just a panel at a conference in Culver City, much like our elected representatives, the things I'd be saying and doing right now would far more likely reflect the interests of the 12% who elected me, and probably more so the people who fill my coffers and ensure my re-election than the fine people we have around us today. And that being the case, the performance I had planned with my comrades to present to you today was just going to sit here in complete silence for my allotted 15 minutes. And I was thinking of going full Andy Kaufman with that, obviously. I'd just sit here and I wouldn't say anything at all. And we'd all just wallow in uncomfortable silence together. And I guess now is probably appropriate for me to confess something to you all. This is my very first panel. I don't know if you can tell, probably. It seems also like it might be my very last.
The reason it's obvious is because you wrote what you're saying. You didn't have a speechwriter.
So knowing all of that, I do actually have a privileged position of courage to shake things up and do things a little bit differently. So I thought maybe I would do this performative thing. Anyway. I also have no understanding of how this was going to work before I got up here. One of my comrades who actually has participated in a panel type thing before was very pessimistic about my ability to sit up here and just be silent for 15 minutes. She said, "You know what, Craig? The MC or moderator is probably going to interject pretty quickly, and you're not going to be able to sit there silently, and you're just going to forfeit your time. So nobody's going to sit in a silent room." I still wasn't discouraged. I figured I could use that as part of the act. I'd be like, well, look, the moderator is the person with the real power. That's the person with the money. Just like our politicians, they're beholden to the money. And I could even echo the oversimplification of Occupy, that one person, that Sabina, represents the so-called 1% actually running things, right? So I could incorporate that into my presentation, and I could probably drag it out for 15 minutes. And then she said to me, well, what if the people in the audience actually leave? And I said, you know what, that'd be great too. I could shout out that the people leaving, I'd be like, hey, you're divesting from a sham election that gives power to wholly owned, silver spoon-fed neoliberal shills like Eric Garcetti. That finding a better way to spend our time is exactly what we should be doing. And my comrade relented.
Stay back.
Okay. Okay. Trying to be loud. But that's good to know, thank you. It seemed I wasn't going to be dissuaded by her reasonable points. I was insistent. So, as a good comrade, she joined me and helped me plan my subversion. And I thought such a performance here would aptly demonstrate just how wasteful electoral politics, especially in this time of crisis and environmental catastrophe, has proven itself over the years. Sure, maybe some of you would think I was a clown, but some of you might agree we have to do something besides pull a lever and wait for power to concede to our pipsqueak-sized electoral demand of incremental ecological reform. Because even when we do win in that venue, we are rewarded with such Pyrrhic victories as the Kyoto Protocol, which has never even ratified by the largest polluter on the planet, our empire, the United States. And domestically, we get things like the EPA, which has been systematically defanged since its inception in 1970. Some of us in this room call ourselves revolutionaries. Right? So my question is, what is revolutionary about waiting 40 more years and engaging in an electoral war of attrition over changing Voter Rights Act or all of these other things, just to maintain the very modest safeguards we achieved in 1970? And the motto of this very conference is system change, not climate change. Right? Anyway, it's time for me to go to my book. I hold in my hands a book very few of you may recognize. I myself stumbled upon it in a vault above the last bookstore in downtown Los Angeles, which if you haven't been, you should go to. This book is called Beyond Repair, The Ecology of Capitalism, by a man named Barry Weisberg, a Marxist-Leninist. It was published in 1971. I think that's important to note. I'm going to read a... Barry Weisberg. Not? Okay. I think in 1971 he would have begged to differ. I'm going to read a couple brief passages just to get my bearing back. The present environmental destruction is increasingly the product of a structure of economic and political power that consolidates and sustains itself through the systematic destruction of the human species and the physical world. We completely fail to grasp the magnitude of death perpetrated by the American Colossus. That's heavy. This is what he was saying in 1971 about the environmental movement. As always, America has made out of social crisis yet another commodity. 1971. And this is his solution. The restoration of natural balance depends today upon the destruction of that social order and the birth of a new poetry of human relations. So that's the book. So let me be clear, I'm not against voting. If you want to vote, I'm certainly not going to stop you from voting. For me, however, electoral politics are merely an arrow in the eco-socialist quiver. But I hope I've made it clear that I personally consider it to be one of the least effective, low-impact weapons available in our arsenal. And while the empire reinforces its armored tanks and extends its array of fortified pipelines that no arrow yet has pierced, we're still sitting here talking about how to sharpen those arrows. So if my good friend Quasi or Mike or Greg wants to vote, I'm not going to try to stop any of them. I'm not going to stop any of you or tell you how to spend your time. I can only tell you what I'm going to be doing spending my time. And it isn't in a voting booth, or going door to door on a get out the vote campaign, or trying to change the Voting Rights Act, or all of these other things, or trying to find the one representative who finally won't succumb to the siren song of finance capital. So going back for one last moment to the 12% who voted for Mayor Garcetti, I want to remind you all of one other percentage. Only 3% of the colonial population here fought in the so-called Revolutionary War. Right? 10% of the population in the United States, in the colonies, actively supported those uprising against the empire. So the question I want to pose in conclusion is, would you rather spend your limited time on this limited planet while it hurtles toward mass displacements and widespread famine, trying to get to maybe 13% of registered Los Angeles voters in order to get them to elect a representative who might, maybe, possibly talk only about elephants, if they want? Or would you rather spend that time trying to convince a mere 3% of the population that there's really no other choice but to smash capitalism altogether? So to reappropriate the language that my capitalist friends use, in a cost-benefit analysis, for me, the answer seems pretty obvious what we need to do.
So who'd you vote for in American Idol?
It was actually a lie. I just thought it was clever. I didn't even vote in that.
So, the next speaker I have great pleasure in introducing is Kwasi Nkrumah. Kwasi is a labor and community activist with a broad range of experience. Kwasi was personally active and literally grew up in the civil rights movements in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Washington, D.C., participating in and building support for numerous local and national civil rights campaigns. He became an active member of the Green Party of California at its second statewide meeting. He also became active in the Greens Green Party USA, where he co-founded a national alliance of activists of color, women, youth, and other special caucuses, which became known as the National Green Justice Tendency. Kwasi.
Okay, well, this has been actually an interesting discussion so far, I think. Craig spoke about the futility he sees in electoral organizing. And Gary, a little earlier, spoke about his frustration with the futility of pure and simple protest politics. And for myself, I mean, I came up in, as Sabina said, in the civil rights movement. I was active in the Black Power movement in the late 60s and the student movement. I was involved in the labor movement for about 40 years. I've been a community organizer and a environmental justice organizer on many different levels for a long time. One thing I have learned in the process of trying to generate change is not to get trapped in either or formulations. I do not believe that electoral politicking at any level will necessarily change things, but I don't write it off as an important element of an organizing strategy because I have seen the impact that effective organizing in the electoral arena has had in many movements in this country historically. And I think that one of the things that all of us need to do as we're grappling with what it is that we need to do in America is I think we need to do a lot more homework on these issues. We need to ask why it was that in the 1800s, almost universally, whenever workers began to organize unions in their localities, they eventually set up independent labor parties. It was almost axiomatic once they had moved to a certain level of organizing around their issues that they began to build independent political organizations to raise their issues at another level. The same thing applies to the women's movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were very active in something called the National Women's Suffrage Party, which was one of many tactics which was used to fight for the right to vote for women. In the black liberation struggle, and not only them, also Victoria Woodhull in, I think, 1872 was the national candidate of the National Reform Party. At that time, she was the head of the women's suffrage organization. She got blasted out of the water behind a sexual scandal because she was an advocate of free love. And at that time, that was considered extremely radical, particularly for a woman. She eventually actually had to leave the United States behind all of that. But her vice presidential candidate on the National Reform Party was Frederick Douglass. Carrie Chapman Catt and a lot of the women who had advocated for the 18th Amendment set up an independent party called the National Women's Party in 1920 because they felt that for women to really be free, they had to organize outside the existing structures of our political system in order to meet their objectives. Likewise, in the farmers' movement, the Populist Party back in the 1890s was a very important element for some of the things that Gary and Mike spoke to in terms of actually implementing significant reform legislation throughout the 50 states, and everything from the price of tariffs on farmers who wanted to store or ship their grain across the country against the big agribusinesses that were being organized at that time, to the ending of child labor in many states, the passage of health and sanitation legislation in the cities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a long history of it. I've been involved in some of that history in the Black Liberation Movement and in the labor movement. I was the National Labor Commissioner of the National Black Independent Party, which grew out of the National Black Political Assembly, which was a broad-based independent politics formation that came up in the 1970s. I was, in fact, active in the Green Party for a number of years. I was the coordinator of the Alliance Building Working Group for a number of years in the Green Party. I was active nationally. I was one of the 3 national coordinators of the Green Party. So yes, I have some familiarity with both electoral politics and mass organizing. But it doesn't seem to me to be an either-or equation. This is part of what we really have to learn in America. One of the speakers earlier in a workshop that I was in was speaking to the history of left-green politics in America, and he correctly pointed out, how small the total numbers of people in this country are who are active politically trying to challenge the capitalist system as such in America, and how ridiculous it is, some of the factional struggles that we engage in when we actually represent almost nothing on the political horizon in terms of our mass influence wherever we are, whether we're talking about locally, nationally, or what have you. I was one of the initiators of Occupy LA. I had to go to court twice this week because of direct action activity I've been involved in. So I'm not a stranger to direct action, and I'm not allergic to it. On the other hand, I also don't think that electoral politics just means running candidates. It also means, I think most significantly, for people who really want to organize communities, it means getting involved in ballot issues. Around critical issues you want to organize people around, large numbers of people. There are many ballot initiatives which have already gone on the ballot or been on the ballot that have been quite significant in building mass movement. We probably need to have more. Right now there's a group organizing here in California around something called the Homeless Bill of Rights here in California, in which they're trying to raise up issues of access to food, access to housing, access to sanitary facilities for people in our state who are homeless. Is this something that we should throw in the trash can because, it's not hip enough? It's not cool enough and electoralism is irrelevant? I don't think so, okay? So I don't really buy into that. Also, from my study of some of the major movements around the world that have actually moved massive numbers of people to radically change their conditions in society and the dynamic between those who are dispossessed and the systems they're struggling with. It's not a question, again, it's not a question simply of pure and simple protest politics or pure and simple electoralism. There is another basic principle I haven't heard people talk about here when we talk about building a movement that could fundamentally change our condition. And oddly enough, it is an idea that both Lenin and the Bolsheviks in Russia and the Spanish anarchists movement, whose politics and principles were quite radically different, fundamentally agreed on. And that was the concept of building something called dual power. Now, before we can challenge an existing system and move a nation full of people who as Craig correctly pointed out, 80 to 88% of them don't even participate in representational politics as we know it today. To move the population at large in a way where they're actually in a position to change their condition, the first thing that you have to do is you have to actually create the basis of what Lenin called dual power. And dual power is the prerequisite to moving to either seizing power or destroying power altogether. I mean, that's still a debate between the Leninists and the anarchists over that question. But the reality is you can't even approach those questions unless you've dealt with the issue of dual power first, which is building up a strong enough basis among the population to actually be in a position to determine how to go about changing the structures of power that you're up against. And I think that that's really a lot more what we need to be looking at in the United States. I think that we have to look at the fact that in all these movements that we can talk about, whether it was the labor movement, the black liberation struggle, the women's movement, the farmers movement, the socialist movement, there are all these movements which actually at some point reached a realization that they really needed to have their own independent basis for organizing their political struggles, including in the electoral arena. All these movements ultimately failed to develop enough viability, whether inside or outside the electoral arena, to actually change the fundamental power structures that they were up against. And a lot of this is because of the very dynamic, I think was the term that was used by someone earlier, ability of the people who control power in this country to figure out strategies of actually co-opting and diffusing our movements and depriving us of the ability to build those alternative structures and bases of power for ourselves in challenging their power in society. They have co-opted us again and again and again. They have diffused us again and again and again. And they have frustrated us again and again and again. And this is what we are really up against, whether we're talking about organizing in the electoral arena or organizing at the community base, whether we're talking about organizing in workplaces with workers, or in the prisons, or in the schools, or any place else. And I really just think that as long as we lock ourselves into simplistic formulations about this, we're going to stay in trouble. And we're going to stay marginalized in the reality of the day-to-day politics and day-to-day lives of the majority of people in this country. And that is the gap that we really need to be looking at closing. As far as electoral politics are concerned, I've never actually been much concerned to run as a candidate myself, although I did once as an independent for city council in Baltimore. But that's a whole nother story. But despite that, what I would say is that I also, in my experience, many of those who take up the call to try to organize independent politics kind of do so up in the clouds. They do not spend enough time building a mass base in communities, a base which is strong enough and democratic enough and broad enough that it in fact can be resistant to the pressures of the corporate structure, to the pressures of the existing political powers in this country, and to the tendency, which is built into our lifestyle in America, of people not being up for a long-term struggle to change their conditions. I mean, part and parcel of these struggles that we talk about is an internal struggle in our own ranks to throw off the conditioning that the consumer society has bred in the broad masses of people in this country. Number one, it tells them that they either have no responsibility, no right, or no role in determining the social policy or the politics of the society that they live in. Number two, frankly, it cultivates an opportunist escapism among broad masses of people. They're always looking for someone else to take the weight, whether it's a Democratic Party politician or even a millionaire mayor of New York or some other figure of, least likely figure to ever be interested, much less equipped, to resolve their problems in life. And all of this is part and parcel of what we have to grow up with. So for myself as an activist, as an organizer, whether that is doing electoral organizing, whether it's around a candidacy or around an initiative. Usually for me it's initiatives. Sometimes it's candidates. I helped manage the Ralph Nader campaign here in Los Angeles when he first ran in 1996, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm just saying to say that as long as we lock ourselves into these either-or formulations about what we're doing, and as long as we spend too much time figuring out if we are more pure than the person sitting next to us in terms of the total purity of what we're doing versus what they're doing, we are not going to break this isolation, and we're doing this at a very critical time. Every type of crisis that we can imagine is escalating, out of control. The economic crisis is running out of control. The ecological crisis that we're supposed to be here to talk about this weekend is running out of control. Global warming is a reality. The heat wave that has had people sweltering in this town for the past couple of months is a reality, and it's a change in our conditions. And these realities are moving a lot faster than we are, or even faster than we can, to organize people in order to do anything about them to change our conditions. So we've got to change that fundamental equation, and I hope that in our discussion, excuse me for running over a minute or so, that I hope we will get into some real dialogue about what we can do about that, and more so, we need to have ongoing dialogue in this town among people who are serious political activists, whether you consider yourself non-electoralist, electoralist, or something in between, or none of the above. We need to have more of these types of forums and discussions where we can have serious and principled exchange of ideas about what we can and are doing about our condition. Thank you.